Welcome everyone to today's podcast. My name is Paul and I'm a happy member of Cocaine Anonymous and I live in Peterhead in Scotland. I'm really pleased to be joined by Eden.
Hello.
So today we're going to be looking at the question, how do I sponsor? What do I do? What do I say? How am I going to do it? There are now about 18 podcasts on this channel. Please feel free to check them all out. We also have another podcast on what is sponsorship that we did several weeks ago. We also have another podcast on am I ready to become a sponsor, which we did last week. So please check those out. So this is the third installment on the topic. And, you know, I'm really pleased, Eden, that you've agreed to join us today. I just want to make clear, I'm not a spokesman for CA. I'm just a member sharing my experience. And yeah, so before we get started, I'd just like to hand the floor over to Eden to share with us his thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll go from the from that first. You've opened up with how do I sponsor there, and so I'll kind of try and link in from that am I ready to be a sponsor podcast that you did before, and I think the first time that I sponsored anyone, I didn't feel ready. I was but I was, I was, and it took my sponsor to say to me, look, you don't really need me in the way that you think you need me now. What you need to do is you need to be sponsoring somebody else. And it took the validation of my sponsor to tell me that I was ready to sponsor somebody else, for me to then take that step. And there are as many different sort of ways of sponsoring as there are people, I suppose, in a way, because you're going into quite an in-depth conversation with somebody, and so it does become, even if it is more professional in nature than personal in nature, depending on your style of sponsorship, that there is it is still a relationship, whether it's regarding of how much both parties put into it, and the way that I sponsor is, I found that me, just as a person, and I think that I should say as well that a lot of this that we're going to be talking about here is just my opinion, and I'll make sure that my opinion, when I'll try and say to you, look, this is my opinion, rather than this is this is an irrefutable fact, because the nice thing about my opinions for other people is that they can be absorbed or dismissed without consequences. So the way that I sponsor is because I'm me and I can't be anybody else, is I do tend to get kind of a little bit emotionally involved, or quite emotionally involved, with the journey of the person I'm trying to help. And so for that, because that's me and the way that I go about things, I can't take on too many newcomers at once. And there are people who can, and they're brilliant at it. But the way that I sponsor is, I don't really hammer home a great deal of musts in a very hard way, because that's not the way I talk anyway. I just say to the new guy, well, look, the person you're supposed to be and the life that you're supposed to have is 12 steps away. So why don't we go and get it? And so that's the way I sponsor, is a sponsor in a very I sponsor in a very tender way in comparison to quite a lot of other sponsors that I know. Is that a good start?
Oh, absolutely, and I would agree entirely. And I think gentleness and kindness rule the day. And in a nutshell, prayerfully and thoroughly is how I try to do it. And lovingly. And I remember, Eden, you said to me months ago, it's good to keep a sponsor close, and I think, and I've ran with that, and that's the beauty of this program. We get to share our experiences, and it is a close journey, and to see people months in, still free and starting to live the dream, starting to realize the promises, starting to experience, having crossed that bridge to normal living and gone through that archway to freedom. It is a marvelous thing. And then to have them ask questions about how do they sponsor, and it's a question I'm sure you've been asked several times as well, Eden. So, in terms of sponsorship, I usually say to people, look, I'm not the typing that says, right, now you've completed the 12 steps, you must sponsor. And some sponsors say, oh, before you start the 12 steps, right, when you've completed them, you must then go on and sponsor. That's not how I do it. That's not how I see it. Some people have got serious mental health issues, for example. Some people simply do not have a great deal of time. There are other ways they can carry the message and do service and get involved and support others, which is a form of sponsorship. So I don't insist people take other people through the 12 steps. I believe it's a program of suggestions, so but there are some things, Eden, I need to be clear on before I agree to sponsor anyone. Right. I need to be clear on these things. Right. I need to have a reasonable working knowledge of our basic text, which, by the way, is what we've got on screen right now. We've got the chapter Working with Others, which is chapter 7 of our basic text, a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, often called the Big Book. You can read or listen to this book 24 hours a day at aa.org. And that's our basic text right there. So I need to have a reasonable working knowledge of the Big Book. I need to have a good working knowledge of the 12 steps of Cocaine Anonymous. I need to be clear what method I'm going to use. You mentioned this, Eden. I need to be clear what method I'm going to use to take them through the 12 steps of recovery. I need to have an understanding of what boundaries I'm going to try to maintain. I need to have an idea what time frame I intend to have. Is it going to be 3 weeks, 6 weeks? I also need to be clear what requirements I'm going to be making of the person. And I'll hand it back to you, Eden, in a moment. But I'm with you, because my experience has shown me the more requirements you make, the more requirements there are that will be broken. And then what you're going to do about it? You can't be punitive with sponsees. People don't keep their promises. People don't keep their time, so they do break boundaries and they don't keep requirements. So the less I make, the less problems I have. However, the one requirement I do make is that if we agree a time, we keep it. What do you think?
Yes. So, from what we're saying, then I think there is that it's really interesting that when someone has like you or I, for example, we could say that we've been restored to some kind of element of sanity. Okay, so we've been restored to sanity, and then to then have to then expect people who are still either sick or insane, even if they don't realize how sick or insane they are often. Because I know for me, my behavior didn't balance out probably until I was about 2 years after putting down the drink and drugs. I was still quite outlandish in my in the things that I was doing. Even though I wasn't drinking and using, I took a lot of emotional settling, and I didn't realize, just basically how polluted my thoughts and feelings were from, as a result of the amounts and the length of time that I was drinking and using for. So to then kind of have expectations that upon somebody that is still sick and insane, there has to be a massive amount of love, patience and tolerance shown towards, you know, that person who is trying to get into recovery. And I don't make an awful lot of you know, you were talking about timescales and stuff, and that's all things that I discuss with the person who's asked me to sponsor them. So because of the way that my life works, you know, there might be sometimes where someone will ask me to sponsor them, and I can say yes, I can, but I'm going to be going away in 3.5, 4 months, and I'm going to be going away for quite a long period of time. So if you want me to sponsor you, we will have to do it in that time frame, you know. And because I'm still, like I say, I'm still me. I can't, you know, I can't like stop my life just because I'm being of service, you know. So and then there will be times when I will have a little bit longer, and there'll be some times when you know, someone will be, say, been serially relapsing for quite some time, and you know, or well, you don't really relapse until you've done the 12 steps. You just carry on using while going to meetings. You know, you can only really relapse after you've, you know, done the 12 steps. You know, then that's a relapse, really. But the you know, but they've carried on picking up anyway while they've been going to meetings. And then I might say to them, look, we need to crack on with these steps. You know, we really need, you need to, I think, from talking to you, from having that initial discussion, from hearing what you've been saying to me, it sounds to me like you need to get these steps, and you need to get on with them really quite urgently, because you know, you keep picking up, you know, and if we don't crack on with it, then the chances are you'll drift, you know. So there might be, and then there might be somebody who is different to that, you know, who will say, well, look, you know, I really struggle with reading and learning and that kind of thing. So, you know, I will give them more sort of easy questions and structure, and take things from maybe the green and gold that will be applicable to them, and tailor it around what they might be able to do. Somebody else, you can just give them the, you know, you can sit with them, tell them to read that bit of the big book. You might be able to do it over the phone and tell them what they, you know, then they'll tell you what they think about it. Somebody else, you might have to sit and read it with them. You know, I've had guys who, you know, can barely read at all, you know, when they come into the fellowship. And so it's just, you then have to really unpick that book for them, because they cannot digest it at all. You know, they just are not familiar with using the written word in any aspect of their lives. So it would really be, you know, that first bit of how do I sponsor, I would give myself the information of how I'm going to sponsor that person according to what that person tells me their needs are from those first initial couple of conversations. And then, yeah, like you say, if things go slightly awry, if things go slightly astray, you know, everything in life is either a lesson or an opportunity, you know. And if something goes a little bit astray or a little bit wrong in those first, you know, in those first 3 or 4 leading up to step 4, then it's just, we've learned a lesson. You know, we've learned a lesson,
Absolutely.
dust ourselves off, carry on.
Absolutely. You know, and just to let our listeners know, I've got 3 general questions, which is the first one on what do I need to know before I agree to sponsor? And secondly, what does that initial conversation sound like, which we're about to go on to, which you've already touched on? And thirdly, will be what suggestions do I give? So, you know, just for me, just to tail off on the first question, you know, I need to be clear what my boundaries are. So I don't say to people, call me anytime if I'm not prepared to answer the phone anytime. A lot of people do. Oh, call me anytime. Oh, he's called me up in the middle of the night again. Well, did you say to him you could call him anytime? Yes. Don't say that if you don't. Yeah. You know, I need to be clear on what requirements I'm going to make. You know, so I'm there. These are, I guess, in what I'm doing is I'm discussing what I can be clear on before that initial phone call, and then I'm going to go on to the second question. What does that initial conversation sound like? I'm also clear, Eden, that I don't need to agree. I usually take on everyone that asks me, Eden, but I'm not obliged to, right? If
No,
I
yeah,
think they're for whatever reason, if I don't want to take them on, I don't. I just say no. Just say no. If only it was that simple, eh?
yeah. If only we'd have paid more attention to Grange Hill when we were growing up,
So I'm not obliged to take on everyone that asks me. And furthermore, which brings us on to the next one. What does that initial conversation sound like? So I might agree at the end of a Zoom meeting or a face-to-face meeting to sponsor someone. I'm still not entirely obliged. Once that doesn't constitute the initial conversation for me. A 30-second or a 2-minute exchange in a Zoom meeting or perhaps at the break or towards the end of the coffee break at a meeting, an initial conversation for me is at least a proper 20-minute chat. And during that 20-minute chat, I will decide. And even after that phone call, I can still prayerfully contemplate, because it's a large commitment. If I agree, and I agreed to sponsor a new man yesterday, Eden, right? I'm committing to 40, 50 hours of completely altruistic time and energy, which I absolutely don't mind doing, right?
No,
But it's a real commitment on my part, So on that initial phone call, or meetup, I want to know what the drug of choice is, a little bit about the using history, a little bit about the domestic situation. Are they clean? Might sound like an obvious question, but people are very deceptive. I've been not got onto step 2 with chaps. They said, I've something to tell you. What? Well, I've been high as a kite when we've been doing the step work. Oh, so are they clean, and are they committed to the 12-step process? And so I need to know those things. I don't want to know their surname or their address or anything personal. Don't misunderstand me, but I want to have a bit of an understanding of where they're at for the process of recovery from addiction. What do you think?
yeah. So and I think it's about again, knowing yourself and what you can do. And again, I will make probably slightly different requirements of different people, depending on depending on where they're at, because there have been people that have asked me to sponsor them and they've already got 2 or 3 months clean, so but because they've been going to meetings, and it sorted them out to a point where they now can hear that if they want to stay clean and sober, then it would be better for them to get a sponsor. So then they ask me. And then there are people who kind of fling themselves at you in desperation on day one, and and obviously their circumstances are different. So I say very much the same sorts of things as you described, but I add in some things for some people. Like I might say to somebody that, don't call me if you've picked up. Like, don't call me if you're on it, because there's no point. It's too late then. Call me before you get on it, because I'm very happy to talk to a man. I'll talk to a man for hours if I think it's going to get him through the day. I'm totally down with that. But I can't talk to a drink or a drug, because they don't listen. So that might be something that I would say to somebody. And I think I often as well, like you said, which I do say to most of the sponsees, is exactly that. Stay very close to me in those early days. Stay really close to me. Don't try and think too much. And don't worry about your life. Put your recovery first, and your life will fall into place behind it. And just try and plant the seeds of faith. That if they're open and willing to, I hammer home that willingness thing. Is that it's not about being willing now, It's about being willing tomorrow morning and the following morning and the morning after that. That's where the willingness, that's what willingness is it's willingness not just to be willing right now, because of course when you're right in the, up to your neck in chaos and mayhem and, whatever it is that where your addiction's taking you, you are willing to do anything. But it's it's telling them to maintain that willingness and to stay very close to me and to keep going, because it can be, it can be, those early days can be so hard. And it's worth saying to them that just getting a sponsor doesn't necessarily mean that they're any safer or more protected than they were before. Because as you well know, like I also sometimes will say to people, look, I'm not responsible for your recovery. You in conjunction with your higher power are responsible for your recovery. I just tell you where to look. It's like I'll hold the torch for you, but you've got to do the digging. Does that's the, that's some, because sometimes, if you sort of tend to find that people aren't praying, they're not meditating, but they are ringing you all the time, well, then there's a hole in their recovery process that they need to bung up, and you as the sponsor need to say to them, this is why you're not feeling right, but then you're feeling so much better when you get off the phone to me, because you see it on guys' gratitude lists all the time. And I know there's nothing in the big book about gratitude lists, but we use them. You see it like in their gratitude lists all the time. I felt terrible, and then I spoke to my sponsor for half an hour, and then I felt so much better. But there's nothing else, but they haven't been doing anything else in that beginning of the program that you told them they would need to do if they wanted to stay clean and sober. Those would be, very sort of loose boundaries, or stronger suggestions that I would make in that beginning conversation.
Absolutely. And just as method, boundaries, requirements and time frame fluctuate wildly amongst sponsors in sponsorship and different sponsors. So do, there's various types, if I could use that term, of sponsees. So if I'm taking on a chap that's been a crack and heroin addict and living rough for 25 years, Eden, I'm going to do a slightly different 12-step process than a weekend binge drinker who drinks for like 12 hours on a Friday, Saturday night. And that's chiefly, particularly around step one. I just want to speak briefly about the method. So this chap yesterday, he will read the doctor's opinion. He will read step one out of the 12 and 12. Right, and in the last few months, we've got these wonderful podcasts. So I'll have him listen to our 2 podcasts on step one, by which time he'll be well sick of my voice. Which will make our telephone calls shorter. And he will have answered about a dozen questions on step one, pen to paper, which I send him by email, questions 1, 2, 3. And then he will send me pictures of his written responses, whether it's a short answer or a long answer is up to him. And then we will spend probably an hour talking about step one over the telephone. And that is how we work step one. If they have been had a really solid using career, like a reputable using career, then I will also have them complete a powerlessness or a trio of lists: consequences list, a powerlessness list, and an unmanageability list. And we will also talk through them. So it could be 3 telephone calls. I keep the calls to around half an hour, 45 minutes. So that's a quick shout out to method. And you hinted at this, Eden. It very much depends on the individual as well. And when it comes to time frame, a quick shout out to that. if they're unemployed or they've got time and willingness, then, some of us are very fortunate to be able to devote more time to the 12-step work than others. You know what I mean? So if someone's got the will and the time, then I don't mind, particularly early on if they're new in. And as you say, some people seek sponsorship with months clean, reasonably well established, and already thoroughly on that bridge to normal living. Some people are desperate, confused, in a terrible situation. So it's horses for courses, and you've got to make judgment calls as per the individual as well. And so just to come on to that initial conversation, you can get an inclination of where people are at after you've spoke with them about these matters. And I just want to give a shout out to the big book. This whole chapter, Working with Others, describes very, very well this topic. So, and there are pamphlets on the CA website. What is sponsorship? I believe there's 2 pamphlets on there, and I'm sure there's lots of other information available. So just to come on to what suggestions do I give? What suggestions do I give? So in general terms, I would suggest, if they don't already have a home group, which is basically a 12-step meeting, face-to-face and or online, that they attend regularly. People get to know them. They get to know people there. They perhaps get a bit of service there, and that becomes their home group. They attend, at least once or twice a week. If they're in early recovery and fresh out of addiction, I suggest try and do a meeting each day. Try and have at least 2 conversations with people that are somewhat established in recovery every day. Try and read at least a couple of pages of the big book each day. Try and practice your own personal type of prayer and meditation, contemplation, reflection, those kinds of things. Over to you.
Yeah. I mean, exactly the same. Exactly the same as you. Is just really, if they're in early recovery, is I really hammer home that get to as many meetings as you physically and personally can. Whether that's face-to-face meetings, online meetings, whatever you can do, whenever you can get to a meeting, get to one. And like you said, there will be people who whose circumstances are all different. They're all different. It's more difficult for those people who have got, say, young families, because they've got a partner who is at home, and they've lost they've been losing their loved one to addiction for many years, and then they're just going to feel like, if they go out to a meeting every single night, that they're then losing their partner to this other obsession, this other thing that they've got. So it is getting that balance right. I do use the gratitude list thing. I do use that. I think that not only that, it's a it's quite common practice, but I think the reason that I suggest gratitude lists to my new guys is that there is it's really good training to then be able to go into step 10. So it's a really good bit of training, of just putting something down in some sort of text format that reminds you that you are an addict every day. So it's easier, it's easy. It's not quite so complicated. It's not quite so soul searching. It's just on that one subject. And there is, of course, that very helpful saying that a grateful addict never relapses. So you can sort of sell it to them a little bit in that way. And so I put the gratitude list thing in there, and I also, if they're very early, I will arrange like just a little time every day where we're both free, where they can just check in with me. The thing I said about staying close is just check in with me every day. So just if it's when you get in from work and when you make your first cup of tea or coffee, when you get in, just check in with me. Just give me a buzz at that one particular time every day. Just for the next couple of months, just so that we can get you, just so that you can, even if it's just hello, how are you? I'm fine, or I'm struggling, or it's been a really busy day, or whatever it is, but just so that I know that you're there, and then I'll say to you, are you going to a meeting? And they'll say yes or no, or whatever it would be. But if just that 5 minutes, so it's not the step work conversation, it's just that, just check in, make sure that you're cool, so those are those are the initial suggestions that I make,
Absolutely.
along
And
along with that stuff that you mentioned. But I don't want to cover that ground again, because you've done it, but all of that stuff that you talked about, I do that too.
yeah, and so just to come on lastly, I just realized that there's perhaps another question, and that is the practical realities of sponsorship, and one of the purposes of this podcast is I feel, Eden, and I know I said to you before we started recording, that there is a chasm where people sort of feel obligated to become a sponsor, and if their sponsor is relatively fresh and relatively new, which is often created from the very problem of sort of people feeling obligated to sponsor before they're ready. So it's cyclical.
Yeah.
So if their sponsor's pretty new, they're ill-equipped. They enter into agreements to sponsor people. They're not sure what method they're going to use. There are various methods of 12-step sponsorship. It's a suggested program of action. I know of many, well over half a dozen ways to sponsor, probably a dozen. They're not aware of their boundaries, and they don't have a working knowledge of the big book or the 12 steps. They're not sure what requirements to make, and they're not clear on a time frame. And so I'm aware that, and I just want to say for any of our listeners, because no doubt there'll be people that are very knowledgeable about sponsorship listening to this podcast, by all means contribute to the conversation and add anything in the chat below this video. By all means, please do. And if anyone listening wants to appear on a future podcast, let us know. There's no problem there. So, it's just an attempt to share some information that may be helpful. And I think the last question I'd like to come to for my part, Eden, is the practical realities of sponsorship, right? And this comes to boundaries. At what point do I call a halt to proceedings? Let's imagine someone has not answered the phone on 5 occasions when it seems that they could have, or what happens if they're late with their step work more than 3 or 4 times? What happens if you think that they're using and they're not telling you? I mean, these are some of the realities. The reality is, from time to time you spot untreated alcoholism. And in my experience, it's not helpful to always tell them. People don't like to be told things, and
No.
so the practical realities, and so these kinds of things, and ultimately, as they say in NA, calling them on their BS, and probably I only do that 30-40% of the time. You've got to be gracious and give people the benefit of the doubt. And if untreated alcoholism forbid people from taking the 12-step process, nobody would do it.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of non-starters, wouldn't there? Yes.
I mean, I actually said that to a chap the other week, so I don't want to sound as though I just come up with it on the spot. I said that I actually had to say that to a chap. And that's the reality of it, and that's one of the reasons why I don't set lots of requirements. The only requirement I guess I do, Eden, but they're very clear cut, and I always say, look, if we mutually agree a time, right, you will keep that time, right, and if you don't, you will only do that a few times, and then you'll have to find somebody else. That's it. Well, then, because I'm not just sitting around waiting for people to phone me up so I can chat about 12-step recovery. I have a life as well. I'm not a doormat. So you know, there's balance with everything. But I do make that abundantly clear, you know. And so, I mean, I sometimes say, look, you know, if I told you 6 months ago that I've got, you know, I've got a quarter of cocaine that you can have for nothing, if you're there at 3 o'clock, you can have it. They will definitely be there. They'll be there at 2:30. They'll take the day off work,
Yeah.
you know, leave their
Yeah,
children in on their own, drive in their
yeah,
pajamas without the headlights on, running out of petrol in the snow. You know,
yeah, yeah,
look,
yeah, yeah,
you know, if
yeah.
we set the time, you keep the time, and you be there, you know. And so calling them on their stuff, you know, and I find that is more difficult to do over the telephone than in a face-to-face setting as well. So I think the thing is to be gracious, but to have discernment, you know, and that comes with time, I think. You know, and then the other thing, and I realize I've said a lot of things. I'll just make this my last point before I let you back in. You know, at what point do I call it quits and say, okay, look, I wish you well. I'm still here as your friend. I'd still like to stay in touch. But as regards 12-step sponsorship, you know, I'm going to give you some phone numbers of chaps that may be willing to give you an experience, and put it in those terms. You know, at what point do I do that, Eden, and how? And have you
Yeah.
ever had to do that?
Yes, yes, and it was something that I certainly didn't take the decision lightly, and I made sure that I did it prayerfully and mindfully. And I also, because I was asking myself the question of, am I removing myself from this sponsorship agreement that I've entered into, because I've copped a resentment against this newcomer, because you know, that would be wrong of me to do that if it was just because I'd got resentful against somebody's behavior or things that they said or whatever. So I need to make sure that my motives are the right ones for coming out of that, for coming out of that relationship, and also to approach that person, like you said, if possible, if at all possible, try and do it so that you can see them, because also what I was, the first time I did it, what I was also frightened of was, I was frightened of that person getting a resentment against me, not because of any reprisal that would come back on me as a result of that, but because I didn't want them to lose faith in the recovery progress, you know, meetings, and I didn't want them to be nervous about going to a meeting that I might be at because, you know, I'd refuse to sponsor them now, you know, anything like that. You know, I didn't want to, you know, I didn't want to jeopardize, like, you know, that person's health, because we are, as we well know, you know, we're on a life and death errand with this stuff. And you know, so to then enter into a sponsorship relationship and then potentially sabotage someone's recovery by the way that I phrase something about coming out of that relationship, I was really frightened about that, the first time I did it. And I'd said the same thing, is that you said, is just, look, you know, we don't seem to be able to connect up sufficiently and consistently enough to be able to maintain the recovery that you need. And exactly like you said, I think that you will get a better and fuller experience by someone that suits you better. So then, you know, and occasionally as well, I have asked a friend who's in recovery if they would be willing to sponsor somebody that I, you know, that I wasn't able to for any reason. So so there has been times where I have literally just gone, you know, like you know, when I did that, it felt a little bit like kind of cutting them open with one hand and stitching them up with the other. You know, it's just kind of moved them up, you know, he's moved them, stood them in front of somebody else and said, look, this guy can, this guy's going to be better for you. Because, you know, I'm not right for everybody, you know, and and some people may need more telling off than it suits my personality to do in order to get them into recovery, or whatever it would be. I don't know what I don't, I can't, I'm sure I have shortcomings, and this would be a very long podcast if I decided I was going to list them all. And
Yeah.
there'll be ones that I don't even know that I've got,
Oh,
so so there's and like we've said before, I mean, with sponsees, I've had every experience. Well, not everyone, but I've had a lot. I've had people that have asked me to sponsor them, and then I've never heard from them again. I've had people that have really struggled around, a certain step, and dragged their heels, and I've had to like kind of pull them through it. I'm thinking, no, I can't see this guy making it much more. If he keeps figuring it up like this, and they've come through. They've come through but despite my opinion being they're probably not. And then I've had guys who seem to be going great guns, loving life, getting on with the steps, and then all of a sudden they decide they don't like step 8 or whatever, and then they've gone. And so it doesn't the so there doesn't seem to be a pattern that I can say, oh, that's my way of sponsoring. That's what always works for me, because I haven't got one. I'm constantly surprised by this, but none of those experiences for me have been any more or less valuable than any of the others, because, of course, crucially, I've stayed clean and sober throughout the whole thing, which is kind of what I came in for,
absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, in the real world, in my experience, Eden, around a half of those that express a willingness to go through the 12 steps actually complete them. And on the note of, am I obliged to sponsor everyone that asks? I've got a friend at the moment agreed to sponsor someone that was really, really rough, really, really unmanageable, chaotic, and unpleasant, and treacherous. And you can usually tell because everything's wrong and everyone's wrong, and they're a victim and everyone's to blame. And
Yeah.
My friend who agreed to sponsor this individual is a very, very sensitive type, right? And this person was like a ferocious beast. They were unpleasant, slanderous, vile speech, full of hate, right?
Yeah.
And all seemed okay. My friend was prepared to do it. And then I spoke to her about a week later. I spoke to him in between, but I had a conversation with her about a week later on this topic, obviously without discussing anything personal. And she was very upset. This person had obsessively rang her about 20 times that day, and it was all hate and bile, and it had really upset her recovery, right, to the point where she
Sure.
wasn't, she'd gone back in a shell. So we've got to use wisdom and discernment. We are not doormats, and the reality is you may altruistically spend 40-50 hours with someone, and they may have a powerful experience. Give them a few months and they could turn around and give you a kick. Not
Yep.
everyone is super spiritual
No.
and everything's great. There's an old proverb. It says, where there are no oxen, the crib is clean, but with the oxen is much increase. So in other words, if you want to work with others and carry a message, it's not always going to go swimmingly. You've got to remember who you're dealing with. However, when a fisherman goes to that river or sea with his rod and his line, it doesn't look like he's much. He's just got his rod, he's got his hook, he's got his bait, but he knows where to cast. He knows the type of bait, and he knows he's got a good chance for catching a fish. And when he catches that fish, it won't be clean. He'll just be catching it as it is, but he knows he'll have a proper feast. And the same way the farmer, so it is a wonderful process. So if you're listening to this, and you're thinking of becoming a sponsor, then very likely perhaps God is prompting you to get into sponsorship. It is a blessed thing. And indeed, it is the essence of the 12th step, which says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to addicts and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. So trying to carry the message is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And of course, 12-step recovery being, in my opinion, the greatest recovery system on the planet, with well over 20 million souls finding lasting sobriety, long-term recovery from alcoholism, from addiction. So it's a wonderful, blessed deal. Now, if anyone has any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. If you're struggling with drugs, please come along to a 12-step meeting and hear the message of hope, faith, and courage. There are thousands of 12-step meetings every single week, and you're welcome at them all. Don't ever be put off coming to a Zoom meeting thinking you need to put your camera on. You don't. Only a quarter or a fifth of attendees have their camera on. Don't feel you need to come and talk. No one's going to be requiring you to talk. In fact, most people at 12-step Zoom meetings don't talk, they just listen. So by all means, come to Zoom meetings. You can get clean. You know, it is possible to have a better future. And I think you'll agree, Eden, you know, that you and I have seen many people that were hopeless dope fiends become dopeless hope fiends. You know, there is a future after drug addiction, eh?
Oh my goodness, yes. And you know, I'm so glad that you said that at the just then, because we've been very realistic about you know, the prospect of being a sponsor and taking on that stuff. And it is a privilege if someone asks you to sponsor them. And it's so worth doing. I know we've you know, it sounds like we've been quite tentative about the idea of are you ready to sponsor? And the short answer for that, to me, if someone said to me, am I ready to sponsor, would be, if you've gone through, like you said, if you've gone through the 12 steps, you don't have to have done all of your step 9s, in my opinion, but you do have to have a consistent, you know, you have to be of, you have to know what step 10, 11, and 12 is, and you need to be applying it with some degree of consistency, even if that's just for a couple of weeks. So I would say that you know, if you're working in your step 10, 11, and 12, even if you haven't completed your step 9s, then the chances are you are ready to sponsor if somebody asks you to. Now, we've been, you know, like I said, we've been quite, really hope we haven't been downcast about the realities of sponsorship, because it is incredible. It is an amazing experience when working through this stuff with somebody else, to see their lives come back together in front of you, to be a catalyst in that happening. And it was only really once I'd done that with somebody else that the program actually really came alive for me. I understood more about what the program was for and how it works. I understood it far more when I went through it with somebody else than I did when I went through it the first time with just me and my sponsor. It really, it expanded exponentially through watching somebody else find their recovery. You know, I didn't teach them anything. You know, all I did was, you know, all I did was exactly was show them where to look. I just gently, like, kind of put them in the right position, because they don't know where to go, they don't know what to do. So all I did was, like today, you know, I still use my sponsor, but I use him like Google Maps. You know, I ring him if something's happening, if I want to do something, if something new is going on for me, then I just make sure that, like, kind of, he looks at the map I've drawn for myself, and he goes, yeah, or yeah, just make sure that you don't, whatever it would be, you know. And I've got guys that you know, use me in that way. So you know, I still have that close relationship with my sponsor, and it is a beautiful thing to be a part of. I mean, I can't do it justice. I can't describe it adequately enough to say how fantastic it is to be a sponsor for people who really want this stuff, and to see one of my chaps, his wife said to me, "You've saved our family, Eden." I mean, how glorious is that? And I had my first massive spiritual experience when I saw one of my lads playing with his boys on the beach, and this guy had lost them. He'd lost his boys, and there he had his two little boys on the beach, and I had nothing to do with it. I was literally just an observer. But those kids had their dad, and there was so much love just in watching them throw stones in the water. It was, yeah, it was one of my first real spiritual experiences, and I wouldn't have had that if I hadn't have chosen to become a sponsor to somebody.
That is so beautiful, and that is the power of this program. That is the value of sponsorship, and that's the blessedness of it. Seeing marriages healed and people become employable, or not lose their jobs, people's sanity restored, their health restored, normality restored. It's a wonderful thing. And we grow and we develop in our manner of sponsorship, don't we? And there comes a point after a period of time where we have to learn other types and other ways, because you hear a lot of people, "Oh, but you must sponsor this way, you must do it this way." No, you can't do it that way. Well, the book itself says this is a suggested program of action. These steps are a suggested, program of action. I've got a chap at the moment that I took through this process, Eden, at the beginning of this year, and we're now starting step 4 later this afternoon, actually, but we're doing it we're not doing step 4 a completely different way. Let me make that point. But it will be different content because he's remained clean. And as I say to persons, I mean, the word sponsor or sponsee does not appear anywhere in the big book for a starter. I'm not over keen on the terms, but for the purpose of communication, I use them. He successfully stayed clean, and he had a powerful spiritual experience going through the 12 steps the first time round. So this time we've done the first 3 completely different. 4 will be the same, and yet the content will be different because he's been practicing to some degree prayer and meditation and contemplation, journaling, and all the suggestions we mentioned, reading the big book daily, attending meetings. He had gone back on his meeting attendance a little bit, so we've looked again at step 2, for example, just briefly about a different method of sponsorship. We've looked at what way our sanity can be maintained, our faith and trust in the process, in the Creator, how we can realize that sobriety and recovery is worthwhile and beneficial to our well-being, in terms of step 2. And in step 3, how can I express that willingness in my behavior and my speech, and what I do, what I don't do, where I go, where I don't go, and then of course the content of step 4 will be different because he's been seeking his God, his Creator, on a daily basis. All this time he's been seeking his higher power in meetings, in the literature and prayer, so therefore he's likely to be less fearful, less angry, and therefore less harmful. So his step 4 will be completely different. So there are many different ways, and we're pretty much towards the end of the podcast. I'll let you back in a moment, Ian, but I guess I've got to watch out to become codependent. It is upsetting. I'm like you, Eden. I've had persons I've worked with that have died. Someone I was working with recently vanished. And when I say vanished, they stopped taking their calls, and it's obvious that they've usually, unfortunately, picked up again their drug of choice. And you've just got to let people be. This is the reality of working with others. It's not always all singing and dancing. And as you said earlier, it's a life or death errand. But we've got to have the life jacket on before we can rescue others, haven't we?
Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. And there is there are times, as we've spoken about in the past, where that I've had to, well, not had to, but I've chosen to, because I care about these people, gone into their homes and explained to doctors and family members when those people have gone back out there. I've spent time talking with doctors and nurses when sponsees have relapsed so badly that they've had to be incarcerated or put into back into hospital. I've gone round their houses and tidied up the carnage of all the bottles and dog ends and all that stuff with them not making any sense and incapable of doing anything. So you're right, it's not all it's not all delight and a linear process of starting on step 1, getting to step 12 and everything's fantastic. You can be along for a bit of a bumpy ride, but again, and it is hard. But weirdly, I mean, isn't it just really something that when I was, pouring wine and scotch down the sink of somebody that's passed out on the floor, and nearly burnt their flat to the ground and stuff, wasn't, funnily enough, seeing them like that, it wasn't in the slightest bit tempting for me, to make off with some of the booze that they'd stockpiled or anything. It was just got rid of it, cleaned them up, put them to bed, and left. And obviously they were in blackout. They don't even remember me doing it. So it's it can be, sometimes, once you've once you've learned how to do this, sometimes you have to get back in. Well, you don't have to, but I did, get back in the trenches again. And yeah, it can be ugly when there's a battle on for people's lives. It can be.
Yeah, and just by way of encouragement to our listeners, if we've been attending meetings, working our 12-step program, reading the literature, seeking our higher power, getting guidance and asking for serenity, wisdom and courage over a period of time, then very likely, absolutely, we are ready to become a sponsor, and we can do this. We can carry this message, with strength and depth and weight. We can get down to causes and conditions. We can look at these things. We can do the column inventory. We can share about alcoholism, the problem, and recovery, the solution. And I think it's very important when sponsoring others to remember that we're dealing with alcoholism, and recovery. I'm not particularly a marriage counsellor, a financial manager, or an agony aunt. I am here about recovery from alcoholism, and so I find that helpful as well. So how do I aspire to sponsor? Well, wisely, discreetly, and courteously. But I have to keep it real. It's not always easy, but it is very, very rewarding. And for those that complete the process, and you see them transformed a period of time later, many of them, continue their spiritual experience, and I've realized, Eden, that for my personal recovery, I have to have vital daily spiritual experiences which involve meetings, my spiritual literature, recovery literature, conversations just like this, that I have every day. And these give me the ongoing spiritual experience vital for recovery, and they keep sobriety fresh in my heart and mind. And we nourish and water the tree that gives good fruit, and getting a sponsee to see the fruit of recovery, the gifts of sobriety, is one of the prime things, to help them to have their own personal, vital spiritual experience, their own psychic change. So thank you everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. I just want to say, we've got a podcast on each of the 12 steps. We've got 2 on step 1, a very, very important step where we look at powerlessness, unmanageability and consequences. We've got 1 that's an introduction to CA program steps and fellowship. I've already said we've got 1 on what is sponsorship, another on am I ready to become a sponsor, and then this one you're listening to now. We've also got 1 on an entire psychic change, living free from addiction. We've got 1 that's ABCs of recovery. So by all means check those out. So most importantly, if you're struggling with drugs, get yourself along to a 12-step meeting, and share honestly where you're at, and get yourself a sponsor, and you too can have this gift of recovery and get free and have a better future. Eden, as always, an absolute delight to share fellowship with you. Thank you so much for coming along today.
Yeah, no worries at all. I'll just finish on this quick thing. As we were talking along, you mentioned there about not being an agony aunt or a financial advisor. And so when I'm talking to someone who I'm working with, if some issues like that do come up, then I make it quite clear in that conversation that if it's about addiction and recovery, then I say, as your sponsor, I would say that you should do this. And then if it's something relationships, financial, jobs, that kind of thing, then I'll say, okay, I'm happy to talk to you about it, but I'm stepping out of my sponsorship role and I'm now talking to you as a friend. So that then they can't, if something goes wrong with their relationship, they can't then say, well, you sponsored me into leaving my job or my wife or anything. And so, well, look, we talked about that as a friend. I can only advise you on advise you on how to stay sober and get sober and stay sober. The rest of it is we're just talking. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And yeah. I mean, obviously, as you intimate, there is a crossover. I'm not harsh with people. I do talk. We'll talk about anything under the sun. I don't mind. But as you say, it's clear-cut direction. We're principally there to guide them through the 12 steps of recovery, that they can have long-term sobriety one day at a time through a personality change where their behavior and their speech changes, and they get free from active addiction. But no doubt, like yourself, Eden, dealing with these things can often be quite a thing at the time, because you kind of want to talk about alcoholism. And in my experience, particularly persons in early recovery, their mind is all over the place. I remember recently I was talking to someone about the spiritual principles of a step, and they're like starting to tell me this long story. And at some point, a couple of minutes in, you have to say, so in terms of the step, I mean,
yeah.
They're telling me about their grandmother's aunt who used to live down the street and what they used to do. So I mean, yeah, absolutely. And a quick shout out to the realities after you've done a round of 12 steps with them. Then you can look at sponsorship and support and encouragement and friendship in recovery. That's what it really is, particularly after you've taken through the 12-step process. You remain their sponsor, their support, their spiritual guide. But I also encourage people to have a support group. I think that's the essence of it. In the multitude of counsellors is safety. And that's one of the reasons why the group works as a higher power really well. I've seen it continue to work very, very well, because the mystery is that it's God's voice in human beings in the group. If I needed counsel and spoke to a dozen recovering addicts, then very likely that would be very sound advice and would get me through. It's that simple. And it works the same. We've got to work the fellowship, not just work the program, work the steps, but we've got to work the fellowship. And having half a dozen folks who you maintain some kind of connection with. I'm not talking about you need to tell them anything particularly personal, or but you have a connection with them, and they have a connection with you, and they may ring you, you may ring them, and you support each other. And that is the essence of the term sponsorship. So again, how do I sponsor? Well, hopefully discreetly, courteously, and wisely. But more will be revealed. Thank you so much, Eden, for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Good to speak to you, Paul.
Okay, family, thanks for tuning in. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.